So last week I get a phone call from one of my buyers telling me that they wanted to make a few changes to their search. But before doing so, they actually posed what I thought was a really good question. They asked me where I felt as though they would get a better deal, whether they should focus on a foreclosure or maybe even consider some short sales. So this week I want to talk a little bit about when you're buying a home, if you can potentially get a better deal with buying a foreclosed home versus a short sale. But before doing any of that, you have to understand the difference between a short sale and a foreclosure and some of the moving mechanics that come along with it. But before we jump into that, a little bit of house cleaning. I'm Chris Nelson with Gemstone Realty, and this channel is all about real estate advice, tips, and tech. So if any of that excites you, you're in the right place. But do me a favor, drop me a comment, hit that thumbs up, consider subscribing, and mash that bell so that you're notified of my future content. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about what the difference is between a foreclosure and a short sale. And really, to cut to the chase, the difference is who actually owns the property. When you're dealing with a foreclosure, the property is owned by some type of financial institution. Usually the servicer has taken the property back through the legal course of the foreclosure action and has gotten to a point where more than likely the previous borrower or occupant is no longer living in that property. Now that's a caveat because that's not always the case when it comes to foreclosures, but most of the times it is owned by the bank and vacant. Now a short sale, on the other hand, although could be vacant or occupied or maybe even occupied by a tenant, the difference is the bank has not foreclosed on the property and it is still theoretically owned by the borrower. So when you're working with a foreclosure, you're generally working with an asset manager who has several files that they're working on, and they usually are just doing things from a spreadsheet. Now, when you're dealing with a short sale, there's a couple different layers. First, you have to get the borrower or the actual owner of the property to come to terms with you and sign off on your agreement of sale. Once that happens, your contract then is subject to third-party approval. And there could be more than just one entity that needs to give third-party approval. Usually the servicer will have to give approval, and if there are any other liens on the property, whether it be a second mortgage or any other debt that has been leveraged against the property, you will also need to get approval from those entities as well. So again, the difference is who owns the property. Now, to understand some of the semantics that comes along when you are buying either a foreclosure or a short sale really kind of helps dial in whether or not there are any savings. I think the biggest misconception when it comes to foreclosed properties is that people think that they're going to get a deal because the properties may be distressed. And what I will tell you, as a realtor who does represent corporate clients, whether they are some type of servicer or another financial institution, there is a science to how they price their properties. And I give people this example. If you were to go into a neighborhood where all of the homes were built by the same builder, the same time, and offered the same amenities, and every home in that development is going for $300,000. Yet you find a foreclosure in that same development for $250,000. Yes, that sticker price is attractive because it appears to be $50,000 less than what is the average, but usually what's happening here is the bank has done their due diligence and is saying, well, we understand that the homes in this neighborhood are selling for $300,000. Our property needs a little bit of love, and that love is probably about $50,000 or so in repairs and or renovations that you would need to do to make the property comparable to the other homes in the development. So let's go through some of the things that you can expect when buying a foreclosure versus buying a short sale. Well, the first thing I already mentioned is that you are dealing directly with the asset manager. Now, whether you're dealing with them directly or you're going through some type of electronic portal, you are not negotiating the sale with anyone who had any previous financial interest in the property or occupied the property or maybe even has been to the property. More than likely, they haven't been to the property. They are making their decisions solely off of a spreadsheet and what they are allowed to do based on the investor guidelines for that particular file. So that's the first difference. Now, one thing to also keep in mind with foreclosed homes is that a majority of the foreclosed homes are vacant. And when homes are vacant, well, usually there isn't anyone there to preserve and maintain those properties. So the longer they sit vacant, the worse condition that they're going to be as time progresses. But that also means that by the time you go under contract with a property, it may take you 30 days to close on it. Well, if no one is maintaining and or improving the property, it's very possible that the condition of the property is going to be slightly inferior by the time you make settlement, which could equate to some dollars and cents. So maintaining or maintenance of the property, other than things like grass cuts and making sure that the property is secure, really won't be done when it comes to a foreclosure, which again could add to your bottom line. Another thing to keep in mind when you're buying a foreclosed home is that there isn't a seller's disclosure. There's no document that gives you some type of insight about the defects that the property might have. Now, of course, when you're going through the property, you're able to visibly see things, and you're able to note that you're going to spend $3,000 or $5,000 or $7,000 on paint, another $5,000 on flooring, but you may not realize that there are cracked plumbing pipes in between the walls, or that the HVAC isn't functional, or some of these other moving things, because you're really, well, you don't always have the option of fully inspecting these homes either. A lot of times they are winterized or they don't have power, which really limits your ability to inspect them. So when you are doing an inspection on a bank-owned property, which is highly encouraged, you may not get to see all of the defects that are there, which again can add to your bottom line. Another thing that can add to your bottom line when it comes to buying a foreclosure is that quite often there are some additional fees that you will be subject to pay as a buyer. Now, some sellers, when it comes to bank-owned properties, will pay what is referred to as customary fees. In the state of Pennsylvania, transfer tax is usually split 50-50. Buyer pays half, the seller pays half. Now, in certain counties, you might pay as much as 4% or 2% each side for the transfer tax. Here in Montgomery County, the transfer tax is 2%, where in a normal setting, the seller would pay 1% and the buyer would pay the other 1%. But when it comes to a foreclosed home, that's not always the case. As a matter of fact, you as the buyer may be subject to paying all of the transfer tax. So if you're buying a $300,000 foreclosure here in Montgomery County, well, that's gonna add $3,000 to your closing cost, which, well, at the end of the day, it's money out the window. You may also be subject to other things such as additional title fees, or you may even have to pay for things such as your use and occupancy permit, which is a document from the township that says that the property is fit for habitation. Usually a seller will take care of those things, but when you're buying a foreclosed home, 99% of the time, the seller will tell you in advance that it is your responsibility to deal with those things at your expense. The last thing to keep in mind when you're buying a foreclosed property is that if there are delays that are on your side, buyer side delays, the seller very well may charge you a per diem. Every day they're going to charge you $100, $200, maybe even $300 until you get that property to the settlement table. So all of those factors very well may add to your bottom line. And even though it may not be a fee, the fact that no one is there to maintain the property and it's only going to get gradually worse as every day progresses could also add to your bottom line. Now, on the flip side, when you're dealing with the short sale, you actually are dealing with the seller, at least in the very beginning. You're going to make an offer that the seller is going to review, and if they think it's reasonable and they're willing to take that offer and negotiate that with their servicer, then you're going to have to deal with the seller first. Then once that contract is signed and you've all come to terms, then it's a matter of the servicer doing their due diligence to make sure that the offer that you are presenting is an offer that they're willing to accept. Now, I want to take a little stop right here and talk about how a short sale is priced and the difference between the pricing of a foreclosure and the pricing of a short sale. When you have a seller who can go to the servicer and say, listen, I know that the homes in my neighborhood are selling for $300,000, but here's why I accepted an offer at $250,000. Here are a list of defects that my property currently has. These are things that a buyer is going to need to take on if they do actually own my property. So you can use that list to negotiate with the servicer to show them right off the bat why the numbers should be lower when it comes to this particular sale. The other thing that a servicer is going to do is they're going to hire either an appraiser or local realtors to go out there and give them a report letting them know how much that house is worth in its condition. The key thing in all of that is the pricing is within reason to its condition. In this situation, that's why it's important to have a seller who's gonna go and make sure that they are listing all of the defects that the property has. Because when you have a foreclosure, as I mentioned before, you really are only going off of what you see, and you can make some assumptions, but if the property has septic, well, you really don't know the condition of the septic until you test it. But a seller who's in a short sale situation could tell you that my septic system is 20 years old and I'm having some issues with it, so you're gonna need to allot 10,000, 20,000, whatever that number is, to correct this if you become an owner. So keep that in mind, because it is important when it comes to identifying or zeroing in on the value of a short sale. Now, unlike a foreclosure, a lot of short sales are actually still occupied, and a lot of them are actually occupied by the previous borrower. Now, of course, it could be a tenant, and it very well could be a vacant property as well, but more than often they are occupied. And there's a unique thing that happens. A lot of the time, in my experience, the previous borrowers who are occupying those properties are still emotionally attached, meaning they're going to continue to maintain those properties. They're gonna cut the grass. They're gonna make sure that if there is a leak, they're gonna address it because, well, they're still living there. Now, a lot of times they don't have the financial means to make the repair the way it should be, but at least there is some type of preventative measures being taken to keep the property from getting worse. So unlike a foreclosure where a property is going to potentially get gradually worse, you do run the same risk with a short sale, but the risk is not as great because, again, if someone is emotionally attached, they're gonna do their best to keep that property as well together as they possibly can. And a lot of times, they don't want to annoy the neighbors. So they are going to do what they can to make sure that the property is at least mildly maintained. When buying a short sale, you're not going to be paying for the seller side of transfer tax. And you're usually not gonna have to worry about additional title expenses either. Now, one thing that you may need to consider is you may still need to take care of the township or the city inspection, which could be their use and occupancy or their licenses and inspections, which again is that inspection that says that this home is fit for habitation. That may be one little unique thing that you need to take on at your expense, but for the most part, aside from that, the fees that come along with buying a short sale are very much like buying a property from a traditional seller, which is gonna help you save some money. Speaking of fees, for delays, there's no per diem. Now, the downside to having delays when it comes to a short sale is that you literally are up against the clock. So if you have some buyer delays, which is expected and it happens, you very well may not have any issues. But if you have too many buyer side delays, well, then the servicer may retract the short sale approval, or the home could actually go into foreclosure before you ever obtain the short sale approval. So timing is still of the essence, but at no expense to the buyer. And lastly, there's a seller's disclosure and someone willing to give you information about the property, which in my opinion has a lot of value. Wouldn't you want to know about some of the things that are wrong with the property so that you're not blindsided once you take ownership? A short sale, well, you have someone who can paint that picture for you because the seller is still legally responsible to disclose all of the defects that they're aware of by using the seller's disclosure. So that is, again, something that can help keep you out of trouble and ultimately save you some money just because you have some knowledge. So at the end of the day, we understand that there are moving mechanics between the two that are greatly different, but where is the better deal? So if you start to tie in all of these different things, in my opinion, a short sale very well may provide a better deal for a buyer than a foreclosure will. Again, you're not going to have to worry about additional expenses from a title or county perspective. You are not going to have to worry about per diems in the event there are delays. You also have the peace of mind of knowing that you can get some background information about the property from the seller, which will keep you from spending a lot of money on unforeseen repairs down the road. And the biggest reason I think, which we haven't previously discussed, that a short sale may provide a better deal to the buyer is because the servicer knows that working with the seller and a buyer during a short sale situation does a couple different things. First and foremost, they know that the property is probably in better condition now than it will be down the road if they decide to foreclose on the property. The other thing is the foreclosure process in itself is extremely expensive and lengthy for the servicer. So if they have an opportunity to, for lack of a better term, stop the bleeding now, usually those are options that they are going to put a lot of weight on, and they will do their best to work with you so long as they're not giving the property away. Servicers are also very smart, and they're in this business to make money, not lose money, so they will approach it and make sure that the property that is being sold via short sale is still being sold for close to what the property is worth in its condition. So there's my thoughts on whether or not there's more opportunity with a short sale versus a foreclosure, but you tell me what your thoughts are. You let me know if you think there's a better opportunity to buy a property and save some money from a foreclosure or as a short sale. And with all of that being said, there's my tip for this week, but do me a favor, check in next week for the very next Just the Tip Tuesday with Chris. Until then, take care.